Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is Recent Reads episode number 29. These are the videos where I talk about the last 10 books that I read. I have a tendency to get really behind on these videos, but I'm trying to always post them as bonus videos now. If this video is being posted on a Monday, that means that I'm on my shit, and if it's not, that means that I'm not on my shit because I don't have anything else to post this week. This is gonna cover the first 10 books that I read in 2020. If you watched my last Recent Reads video, you know that in my great infinite wisdom, aka stupidity, I accidentally deleted my notes. The first few books in this video were also part of the great note loss tragedy of 2021. So if I'm a bit stumbly on the first few books, it's because I deleted my notes on them and my memory of them was not great. So the first book that I read in 2021 was The Beguiling by Zsuzsi Gartner. This really appealed to me. As soon as I heard about this, I was like, I need to read that. I felt seen and I felt loved. So this book follows Lucy. At the beginning of the story, her beloved cousin Sultan, who she has a very close relationship with, dies under really bizarre circumstances. And after his death, Lucy learns that she has developed a very bizarre quality, and it's that she has become basically a magnet for confessions. Strangers keep coming up to her and confessing their greatest sins. I think the title here really does capture the book's core quality. It is a very beguiling novel. I've read Zsuzsi Gartner's work before. I've read a couple of her short stories and I really enjoyed them. She has a very strong style. It's very, very specific. I talk a lot about specificity, but I think Zsuzsi Gartner might be the ultimate queen of specificity. Like, I don't know where she comes up with these details, but every single sentence is wildly, unexpectedly specific. Her work takes quite a lot of focus and mental energy to read. It's not the kind of work that you can read a little checked out. Like, you've got to be very engaged to read it, but it's also fun. There's an electric quality to her prose, and every single page, maybe every single paragraph, or to be honest, it sometimes feels like every single sentence has something weird and original to just admire and find novelty in. And the impressive thing is that that energetic, mesmerizing quality never lets up. Like, that quality of the prose where it's so viciously specific, it spans the entire way through it. I don't know how she does it. I think one thing that I didn't expect from this book is that structurally, it's almost like there's a mini collection of short stories within a novel. So it's like you have a short story collection sandwiched within a novel, which I wasn't really expecting. The story becomes very heavily focused on these different stories of different people who come up to her and start telling her, confessing these bizarre things. It was just a little bit too much of that and just not enough of Lucy. I wanted more of Lucy's story. At the beginning, when we first started getting the confessions, I was very compelled by them. It just felt like it went on a little too much, or with not a lot of Lucy threaded throughout that quite long portion of the book. I wanted her story to have movement and development because the confessions themselves, they were interesting, but they themselves weren't really moving the plot. So that's why I didn't rate this higher, because I felt like it was almost a bit exhausting throughout the middle, especially because the book is so much. It was demanding more investment than I was able to provide in these individual stories when I felt like my true investment was in Lucy's narrative. Still, she's a really fascinating writer. So then I read Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. Her debut novel Homegoing I read a few years ago and I adored it. I love that book so much. And I was really, really excited for this novel. So in this book we follow Gifty, who is a neuroscience PhD candidate who studies mice. She studies addiction in mice. Her brother was a very gifted athlete who died of a drug overdose. It's a book about the interlocking of science and religion in her quest to understand her brother's life as well as his death. This was a very ruminative but quick narrative. Even though it's very internal, it's very reflective. There's not much of a plot in terms of events happening, pushing other events. It's much more reflective. That is the plot. The plot is the character reflecting. It can be hard to pull off a deeply reflective book like this. But I think the very clever thing that Gyasi did was make it very quick-paced in its reflection. The chapters are very short, only a couple pages usually, so there's a lot of movement and energy just structurally. And I think the other reason reason why this plot worked here is just because there is so much emotional depth given to the protagonist. Gifty is really interesting, and she's a character who allows for very interesting internal introspection. I also personally love the science. I love any book that has a science aspect to it. So I thought the science was really interesting. It was written with enough detail where me, as someone not a neuroscientist, could understand it, but it didn't feel like it was being brushed over. I don't know if Gyasi is a neuroscientist, but I fully believe that she is, because it was very convincing. This book does cover many topics, and I think there's a bit of imbalance. Some are given more depth and exploration than others. There was a bit of overcrowding of ideas. In some ways, I think it is partly to the book's benefit that it tries to cover so much. That interlocking of ideas is really compelling, but at the same time, maybe it didn't give enough space for various concepts or threads to breathe as much as maybe they would like. All in all though, this is an intimate read that's very easy to digest in terms of prose and structure. It looks pretty long, but I read it very quickly, but it's very hard hitting emotionally and in terms of character. So the next book is a book of poetry. I'm going to barely talk about this. I really don't have much to say on it. Also lost my notes for this one, and it was Renaissance Normcore by Adele Barclay. I made the mistake of picking up both of Adele Barclay's poetry books many months ago, like literally it was like a year ago. I picked them both up because I had heard some good things about her poetry, and they were both signed at a local bookstore, and so I was like, why not? I want some new poetry, so I bought both her books. But then I wasn't too keen on her other one. Her other book, it's called If I Were in a Cage I'd Reach Out For You. I didn't take away much of anything from these poems. A lot of them to me felt like they were statements of self rather than explorations, which I think there can be a power in. I didn't take much away from them. I don't really have much else to say about this. I didn't actively dislike them, but I also didn't really gain anything either. So the next book here is, I think, the last one that I lost my notes for, so hopefully after this things will be a bit more coherent. It's also one I don't have much to say on because I don't remember it that well. It's Show Them a Good Time. This is a short story collection. I feel like me and this book had like a will they won't they relationship for like a year. There were probably 5 times I walked into a bookstore, almost bought this book, and then ended up not buying it. If you've read Alexandra Kleeman's work, this book reminds me of her writing in some ways, in that it has that like weird surrealist quality. Even when it's realistic, people act weird. However, I prefer Kleeman's work. I'm quite a fan of Alexandra Kleeman. This was not actively bad. Some stories were real hits. Others, it just didn't resonate with me. Especially there's a really long one that, I don't know, I think it would have been more effective as just quite a short piece. This book didn't leave a huge impression on me, and so I don't really remember what I was thinking when I read it. I'm sorry, this is such a bad video. So then I read Vanishing Monuments by John Elizabeth Stintzi. So this book follows Alani, who is a photography professor. At the beginning of the book, they find out that their mother's dementia has gotten to quite a serious point, and so they go back to visit their mother and also deal with their mother's house, which really kind of resurfaces a lot of memories for them. I wanted to like this book so much more than I did. Like, you know when you pick up a book and you're so ready to love it, you're so ready to click that 5-star thing on Goodreads, and then it just doesn't really work for you? That was my relationship with this book. I do want to start about with the positives. The exploration of gender was so interesting. I thought that their non-binary identity was explored in a nuanced way. That aspect of the book was fantastic. This was a nuanced, interesting, personal exploration of gender and what it means to fall outside the gender binary. It wasn't good representation, it was a good story. The story of gender in this book was great. So that was fantastic. And I also thought, so this book uses like a memory palace. The book is greatly about memory. The way point of view worked in the memory palace, the story goes into second person, and I thought that that was really brilliant, and I thought that those were the most compelling parts of the novel. I honestly just found it very hard to focus on the storytelling and the writing because the story felt very zoomed out. It's first person, but it almost feels like a distant third person in some ways. It feels more like context for the events rather than being in a scene. There were very few points where I felt grounded and present in a scene. The book felt just contextual and very distant from the events. So in the end, I only rated this a 2.75, which is really, really low, but it's just because that issue for me was so prevalent and made it so hard to actively enjoy the book. It's a tough one for me. I don't dislike the book. I actually feel kind of fond of the book because I feel like there's some aspects of it that are really done really well, and that kind of knocked it down for me quite a bit. So then I read The Perfect World of Miwako Sumida by Clarissa Gonawan. This book takes place in the aftermath aftermath of the title character's suicide, and it's told in several sections from the point of views of several different characters, friends of Miwako's, who are left confused and not understanding the context or reasons behind her death. It's kind of both a mystery and a personal drama between the various characters. I thought the first 2/3 were really compelling and really strong. The book moves very quickly. It's got a very light touch that in a way sometimes left the characters feeling underdeveloped, but yet I also felt interested by them. They felt clear and interesting, but not that deep. I feel simultaneously multiple ways about the characters. Like, I kind of liked how they were written, but in some ways they didn't feel like that emotionally complex. I'm not really sure. I liked the way the characters were written, but it was also a bit strange. I was quite let down by the end of this book. The mystery wasn't solved through actual solving of the mystery, but through introduction of a supernatural element that's only introduced in the end. The answers we do get about Miwako and her suicide were not that original. I thought that it was a very familiar take. It wasn't really an original or nuanced take on the subject matter. In many ways, it was almost so obvious that I didn't think the story would go there. Really great first 2/3. I really enjoyed the first 2/3. The third really was a bit of a letdown. So then I read Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. So this book follows the title character, Jonny Appleseed. He is fairly freshly moved to the big city after growing up on a reservation. He's a two-spirit indigiqueer cybersex worker. At the beginning of the story, he finds out that his stepfather has died, and the book follows the week between him learning his stepfather had died and traveling back home for the funeral. The standout quality here is the main character. He is one of those characters who you just don't forget. You just won't forget him, and I knew from the very beginning that he was a character who was vivid and clear and interesting and lovable and complicated and just memorable, and I think the book could almost have done anything and I would have loved it on the strength of that protagonist alone, how well written the protagonist was. It's a meandering plot, really without much plot development or structure, but it doesn't need that. Jonny is so interesting that you're happy to just follow him through his daily life and through also his introspection on the past. I thought the ending was really, really impactful. I got a little emotional at the ending of this book. Shout out to this book for being just quite a delight. So then I read Butter Honey Pig Bread by Francesca Ekwuyasi. So this book follows a mother and her twin daughters, set both in Nigeria, where the mother is from and the daughters were born, and then the two daughters at various points live in various cities, London, southern France, and Halifax. And they each have their own storylines that also all tie together. The mother, Kemuranachi, is an obanje, which is like a, well, let me just read what it says. A spirit that plagues a family with grief by dying repeatedly in childhood and being reborn. I was somewhat familiar with this idea or spirit from reading Ekwuyasi's work, especially Freshwater. I'm glad I read Freshwater before I read this book, because this book doesn't really ever explain like what an obanje is. Like a little bit, but there's not a lot. The obanje thing is more of a contextual backdrop, and it's not really explored through its like spiritual component, but more through like its personal component and its effect on the family. So if you haven't read this but you want to, I'd highly recommend reading Freshwater first, because I feel like that gave me some really good context and education to understand this book. The characters in this book were very interesting. I was expecting this to be a bit kind of freaky just because of what I had read about the same subject matter in the past, but it's actually very character driven, and I thought the characters were really interesting. One of them in specific, and I don't know how to pronounce her name. If I have any Nigerian subscribers watching this, can you please tell me how to say this name? Taya? I don't know. What I do know is how much I love this character. I honestly like had a bit of a crush on her, which I think is saying something because this book is so character driven, and so much of this book is exploring this character's flaws. She's the most flawed of the three main characters. She's probably meant to be the most like messy and disagreeable, but oh my god, I really liked her. I liked all three characters, but I was always excited to get to one of her chapters. But all three of them are really interesting characters. Just in terms of writing, very sensory. Like this is a multi-sensory experience. There's a lot of food, which maybe you can gather from the title. Food is super prevalent in this book, and descriptions of food. I was very hungry while reading this. I guess my one comment on this is that I think this was a case of the fictive past being more interesting than the fictive present. There are multiple storylines and timelines going on. The main one in the fictive present I thought was probably the least compelling. I think the characters' past were more interesting than their present. I honestly would have read a full book just about any of the characters' past. The present was probably the place that I found the least impact. Not so much by the end, but throughout most of the book, I was much more compelled by the characters' backstories than the fictive present. It's a very backstory, non-linear book though. Some books can't really pull that kind of imbalance off, but I think that this one did for the most part. So then I read It Is Wood, It Is Stone by Gabriella Burnham. The book follows Linda. She and her husband are from Connecticut, and her husband is a professor and he gets a job at teaching in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And so they move there for a year. The book is about, primarily fueled by the relationships that Linda has with their housekeeper, Marta, and this other woman named Celia that she meets, and it's pretty messy. There is some messy interpersonal drama. The writing is so beautiful and smooth. I think I read this in 2 days. It's not a very long book, but it's just like buttery smooth to read. The sense of place is also amazing. I felt the presence of the city, and the city itself was given character development. The main note that I wrote down, and sorry I'm just looking down because I'm just reading directly from my notes, I guess I wanted something more from the characters, though they were well developed. Linda, the main character, is certainly meant to be frustrating. We're talking Emily in Paris, but like refined literary fiction version. Little frustrating. That's okay. I like frustrating characters. I don't mind being frustrated by a character. If anything, I actually kind of like it. But I think I wanted something a bit more to be revealed about her, whether it reflected well on her or not. I didn't need her to grow. I didn't need her to have a positive change. I didn't need her to have a revelation, but I think I wanted something deeper and more complex to be revealed about her, since she is the main character and probably the least interesting of these three main women. There was a single unprecedented point of view shift that I'm not a fan of. Late in the book, we get a long chapter that gives us Marta's whole life story. And Marta is a more interesting character than Linda is. You know me, I'm not a fan of unprecedented point of view shifts. If the book had been told from both their points of view throughout, I think I would have preferred that. I so rarely get on board with a single random point of view shift late or in the middle of a book. To me, it feels like a bit of a narrative cheat. Like, oh, I don't know how to integrate this character's backstory. I'm just gonna cut to their point of view for one chapter and then we'll cut back. It feels very inorganic to me, so I'm not a fan of it. That's partly a me thing. It's one of my pet peeves, but I think there would have been better ways to handle the exploration of Marta's character in this book other than that one. So to end this video, we actually have my favorite book from the video. It had been a long stretch without a 5-star read. And then this book, You Were Eating an Orange, You Were Naked by Sheung-King, swooped in and saved the day. This book follows the unnamed narrator and various anecdotes or reflections from various cities, Toronto, Macau, Hong Kong, Prague, and Tokyo, focusing around interactions and stories told between he and his partner, who is also unnamed. It's enigmatic and intimate, and it's weird but still cohesive, and it's experimental without feeling pretentious. When I first started reading it, I was like, oh, I can read this in one sitting. It's not very long, it moves very quickly, but I actually slowed down and took a few days because I kind of just wanted to savor it. It's a very intimate novel. The book really only has 2 characters, even though they may interact with people here or there. There are really only 2 core characters. They're both unnamed. They feel very real. Their relationship feels very real. There's not really a plot. It's more a distillation of moments. It was unlike anything else I've ever read. It's quite meta. It references a lot of other books. There's a chapter where the book The Vegetarian by Hong Kong comes up and is quite prevalent, and I'm glad that I had read that book and I knew the context. Murakami is mentioned quite a few times. It's so meta and kind of weird, but without losing the humanity, you know? It doesn't veer into that weird, contrived kind of quality that very experimental fiction can have. It was still very human. The scenes are very brief, the moments are very brief, but it's kind of a heartbreaking brevity where you feel like these are moments that are fleeting and like they can't be held on to longer than the moment that they exist. And I don't know, there's just something very delicate about it. So I really enjoyed this. It's one of the most unique books that I've ever read. I can't wait to read more from Sheung-King. I believe that this is his debut novel. I was fully compelled and enamored by this. Really, really unique read. If you want to read something really, really unique, I really recommend it. I certainly see how the strangeness could rub people the wrong way, but it never felt strange for for just the point of being strange, I think the strangeness was actually quite impactful, and it's not strange in a way that's hard to digest at all. I really, really loved this. It's my favorite from the video. It's so far my favorite book I've read in 2021. Alright guys, so that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.